So now we've come to one of my favorite parts of this course, using these causal diagrams in the context of logic models to think really, really hard about programs, how they work, why they work, being really, really skeptical. This is a tool, and it's kind of stretching how many people use the term logic model, but it's a tool that many of my practitioner students have found really useful for trying to figure out if a program idea is a good one and work to improve a program that they have. So, brainstorming mechanisms with logic models. We've already discussed some of the major uses of logic models. They're used for program management, evaluation, how funders like them, and the fact that there are implementation-oriented logic models that incorporate inputs, activities, and outputs, and that this is not our focus. And with this brainstorming, it is especially not our focus. So when you're using logic models for this purpose, you're really trying to probe deeply into the mechanism. And there are a lot of iterations. I recommend you do this on paper with a really big piece of paper and be prepared to have more sheets of them as you figure things out. One of the key things that we'll be illustrating soon is start at the outcome and work backwards. Also be as concrete as possible. Vagueness is your enemy. And once again, this is not the logic model you're going to want to put in a report or program. It's much messier and more detailed. But this work will be extremely valuable for your report or proposal. It'll give you text to write that'll make your program much more compelling and believable. So for the moment, we're going to stick with the example in the book, and we're going to stick with community policing. So once again, start with your program on the left, your outcome on the right, and think about key mediators. You know, maybe you think, oh, trust is so important. Community policing produces trust. So this is a start, kind of brainstorming about the key mediators. But man, you think, oh, community policing is trust? How? Well, you might say engagement, right? We had engagement of the police with the community. Okay, even then you might say, well, how does community policing produce engagement? And how does the engagement produce trust? A key part of this how is, again, focusing on the unit of analysis. Who or what are these variables describing? And again, there can be aggregates, but you want to think, okay, cooperation, who is cooperating? What cooperation between whom? What is this telling us about? So after you've done a bunch of brainstorming about some key things, you're going to want to go back to basics in two ways. First, you want to specify your program as concretely as possible. What is this thing called community policing? What do you actually do? Well, it's actually a whole bunch of things. But one of the things that is typical is the police walk around the neighborhood. So they see people face to face, and the idea is further than that, that they will interact and talk to people, and people will recognize them, and they'll recognize people. Well, you already see I said a lot more things than is just in that variable, but by being concrete, I'm showing you some of the consequences of that. You also, as I've said, want to work backwards. If this is about community members committing fewer crimes, what needs to change about them? Do they need to know their neighbors better? Do they need to not need income? Do they need to feel less angry? Do they need to feel empowered? What needs to change in them so that they won't commit crime? And in particular, since lots of things might need to change, what kinds of things is community policing and policing knowing members of the community, meeting them from walking around the neighborhood, likely to change that would be one of these proximate causes of crime? So when you're brainstorming, there's just lots and lots of thinking, focusing on the people or the organizations that need to change, being as concrete as possible about your variables. Keep inserting variables, adding branches until the link is obvious, and keep asking why. I often say you want to be like this kindergartner who just keeps saying, why? Well, if people know the police officers, they'll trust them. Why? So there's going to be a lot of iterations. So you can imagine you'll do a much better logic model if you actually know the subject that you're talking about, which kind of makes sense. If you really don't know what you're talking about, you're not going to develop a very good program. And developing a good logic model is like, it's basically developing the program. So you can probably guess that I actually don't know much about policing or community activism or things like that. I stuck with this, but I'm not very good at it. And you kind of can see that in my mechanism. But still, okay, police walk around the neighborhood. Now, I haven't put who. That's because my main unit of analysis is the community member. So if police walk around the neighborhood, the community members know the police officers. If they know them, they trust them. Of course, the skeptical me is going, why? But again, I don't know a lot about this, so we're going to keep going. If they trust the police officers, they'll tell police officers about reasons for crimes. What's going on with the people committing the crimes? What are their problems? What are they angry about? Why don't they have any income? What is going on? And if the police officers know about them, they can address the reasons for crime, and then the people in the community have fewer reasons for crime and they commit them. Yeah, that's still kind of vague. This was my best attempt after I looked up proactive crime prevention as one of the mechanisms through which community policing works, but you can see I really kind of need to know more about what I'm talking about. But again, you're going to want to look at each link. Is it clear and convincing? How strong an effect can you refine it to make it stronger? And again, this level of detail is for brainstorming. It's for you to think about how to make the program more effective. So again, some of this is kind of vague. You see, I don't know what I'm talking about. And particularly over here, I put more specific where I thought it was lacking. So here I've tried to do a bit better. And I've also tried to put in some more mechanism or a different mechanism depending on your perspective. So I've talked about people tell police officers when neighbors have a mental health problem. And then the police can contact mental health providers and try and get help. Now you might say, but hey Dahlia, you've gone back to the police doing something. That really has to be another component of the community policing. The police have to know mental health providers. They have to be able to get them to help community members. So they're going to need resources and empowerment as part of the community policing program to be able to do that. If they get that, then some community members will get more mental health care. Their mental health will improve, less likely to commit crime. I'm also trying to write here another kind of mechanism. If they know the police officers, they're more likely to report the crime. And then the police will know where to patrol, what to investigate. That can make community members who might commit crime afraid of arrest and less likely to commit the crime. Again, not claiming this is accurate because I'm not too knowledgeable, but I do hope it shows you how to think about a logic model, and in some ways, having me not know something shows you that this is a process which forces you to face your ignorance and your weak links and really think hard about how something might work. It's the enemy of vagueness. So again, you might have thought those were two mechanisms. You might have thought they're the same. So what does this look like when I do this? So next I'm going to show you something that I worked on with some colleagues that we didn't actually get to implement, where we were trying to come up with a description of a program for a data and collection and analysis intervention in classes that would make students much more interested in data analysis and confident in their quantitative reasoning skills. So one piece of this intervention, which you may have trouble reading, is the upper left. Students choose questions and administer a survey to a population of interest. The idea is that they get to choose what interests them. And the idea is that would increase compelling context, cultural relevance, engagement in data collection. And because they cared about things and were engaged in it, they'd want to actually know the results. Okay, we're having these questions to describe this group of people, but what are we finding? And that means they would be interested in the data analysis. You can say there was a lot more to it. There were other program components. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 program components coming out of the main intervention. They interacted a lot. This is too much to put in a proposal, but it really pushed us to think hard. It's like, oh, it's really easy to say cultural relevance. How do you get that? What does it do? You know, what are you doing when students are frustrated? How are you reacting to that? So this is a tool. Personally, I do recommend paper and hand drawing, not the electronic version you see here. So I just talked about frustrations and about things that might go wrong. So you see here the whiteboard from when I actually taught in-person students before the pandemic. And this was an in-class group exercise in which the students wanted to talk about a program that they thought had bad effects. So the good program would be to remove this, but they thought it was easier to think about in terms of the program that had a bad effect. So that was nonviolent incarceration. And I took a photo of this, as I did with a lot of things that happen in class, because I thought it was a really great example. So you see that nonviolent incarceration had, among other things, fear of calling 911 for help. And that could result in a drug overdose. People also were more likely to have criminal records, less likely to be employed, more likely to sell drugs around the bottom, more likely to be depressed, to use drugs, to have a drug overdose. And you can see all the things they thought about. So this is not only a great example, but it also shows something you want to do with your program, even if you thought your program was good. Think about its undesirable outcomes, right? So this may seem like a great idea, and it may in fact be a great idea in certain ways, But how could it go wrong? Logic models are a good tool for that. Which brings me to broken windows. So some of you may be using the second edition or the first edition, and you know that that was our theory and models example. So I want to talk about that because broken windows was very influential theory that a lot of people considered very practical, but it's now come into bad repute. So we changed it, but we don't want to just sort of say, oh, don't look at that, don't look at that. Greg Van Rysin and I wanted to talk about, okay, what did go wrong? Was the theory wrong? What was it something else? Was it other things? So we spent a bit of time about that, and interestingly enough, I think that we have some takeaway lessons about logic models from looking at that. So first of all, as some of you may know, broken windows became associated with things like stop and frisk. So stop and frisk was an idea that you see some young men, particularly associated with underrepresented minority young men, you're concerned about what they might do, you just stop them, frisk them. Are they carrying weapons or drugs or something like that? And that was thought of as, you know, a kind of proactive policing. Well, why is that the same as broken windows? The broken windows theory said that disorder resulted in crime. And the idea was when things look disordered, people think, nobody cares. It's, you know, we have no sense of community. Nobody cares about me. Why shouldn't I do things? And the idea was, to some extent, you then crack down on low-level crime because the low-level crimes contributed to disorder and the sense that no one cared. So how exactly do you get from there to stop and frisk? The most charitable thing is that you think stop and frisk is going to prevent petty crime, but it is totally not the same thing. So the first lesson, I think, is that when you have a program, describe it in concrete terms. Saying something like disorder is not a program. So think about your programs in concrete terms. Secondly, look skeptically at each link. You know, they had shown that in some experimental work that if you make a neighborhood all messy and run down and broken down versus cleaning it up and make it look nice, that it did actually have a modest effect on crime committed. Okay, so maybe that's really true. How much effect are you going to expect from, say, cracking down on turnstile jumping in the subway? Is that really going to have a big impact? Also, be wary of large impacts from very indirect paths, right? The way that disorder was going to reduce crime had these long, this will change this, will change this. And maybe you should be skeptical about things like that and think hard about each of these links and how direct they are and what the impact will be. And then finally, the last point I made, develop theories of potentially harmful effects. Think about how, you know, something like arresting turnstile jumpers could go wrong if police tend to be more concerned with lower income neighborhoods or underrepresented minority neighborhoods. What potentially harmful effects could that have? So that's the end of one of my favorite chapters. These causal models with the variables and the arrows are tools we're going to use again and again in this course. We'll use them for things like figuring out non-response bias to a survey. And we're going to use them a lot in the second half of the course when we focus on causal effects. And how do you figure out what the effect of some X is on some Y? It's going to be very powerful then. Next chapter, qualitative research, and that, it turns out, is very important to giving us evidence about mechanisms.